Hello everybody, Brad Johnson here, and in this video I'm going to be talking about Know the Living God. Now, of course, before I begin, I'm just going to paraphrase from a good friend of mine, right, Adronis, where he shares that everything that I'm about to share is simply that of my perspective, for all knowledge resides within yourselves. So, now that I've given that disclaimer, we'll look into this topic regarding Know the Living God. Now, just today, I was actually going for a walk into a beautiful park in North Vancouver, and I was getting this download as it was coming through, as I was just walking through the park, going through the paths, right, just getting this download. Because on my mind, I was really just looking into doing some kind of inner self-inquiry while I'm walking through the park, right? Just basically saying I, or B and B and B and B, and you're just in that space of quiet. When you go into that state of self-inquiry, like I said, you're just walking about, going through nature, your mind just becomes completely still. And that's exactly what I was feeling. I was just having this kind of joyful, compassionate smile, walking through the entire park, through the trails, and I was getting this download. And that download is about the nature of the living God, right? So when we go into self-inquiry, we're remembering who we really are, because really, we haven't forgotten. It's just the ego and its ignorance that gets in the way, and it basically is, for an analogy's sake, like clouds that are blocking the sun. But as you start to clear away that ego and that ignorance, like I've recommended, through self-inquiry, because that is the direct method that Sri Bhagavan, Ramana Maharshi, has given us, working with that, you're seeing those clouds part, and now you're seeing the sun. You're being aware of being aware. But as I was doing that through the park, this download was coming to me about understanding the living God. Because I have also talked about through this YouTube channel, the one will, right? Following the one will in life, that there is really only just one will. We ourselves, as an ego personality, have no will of our own. And we just give the impression that we do, and when we start to follow that egoic will, it falls apart. It becomes dismantled. It leads us into unpleasantness. It leads us into discomfort, and it leads us into confusion. But when we go into the one will, that is the true will, and each of us has our own one will. But really, there is only that one will. Well, if we're looking at permanence, if we're looking at the true self, who we really are, we understand that perfection itself is the following. Okay? It is changeless. It is eternally changeless. It is formless. Okay? It is self-shining. And it is impersonable. Okay? There is no personality. There is no personhood relating to the nature of the true self. Right? The permanent self has no form of will of its own. It is only aware of the self. The self is only aware of itself, right? That is where it is self-shining. It's only aware of the experience of its own light. So it does not acknowledge the mind at all. It has no awareness of the mind. It has no awareness of what goes on inside the mind. So the permanence itself, has absolutely no acknowledgement or awareness of the mind. This is where the living God comes in. The living God willed itself into being. And we could refer to the living God as him or her, whichever you prefer. The mother, the father, the grandfather, the grandmother, the creator, the one, whichever you want to refer to, the divine. Okay? But basically, when we look at the nature of the living God willed itself into being. And through that willing into being, became aware through the mind. And it was through the mind to which life itself was created, through that instantaneity of awareness, through the willingness of God willing him herself into being. And so when we look at the living God is the overseer of all life. It is the sovereign of all life. It is all that is, and it is all simultaneously created here and now. This is the nature of creation, right? Just goes back to what Jesus would talk about through the nature of the living God, right? The living God is the king of the universe, right? We could also say queen of the universe, that's fine as well, right? But he would call the Father the king of the universe, right? So therefore, the living God is the sovereign, is the supreme soul, is the supreme mind, and is the supreme spirit. Now, is the living God permanent? Yes. But here's the difference. With the living God has personhood. The living God has personality, infinite personality, infinite personhood. And so the living God is what you can build a relationship with. The living God speaks to you. I know this because the living God speaks to me. This is how I was able to get all this information to share with you today. Not to mention conversations, downloads in the past as well. So yes, you form a personal relationship with the living God. Now, the living God does not see you in this human physical form. The living God sees you in your perfection. This is why Jesus had to go out into the desert for what was said in the Bible, 40 days and 40 nights, to commune with God, and basically feeling, in that sense, being tempted by the devil, otherwise the ego. During that 40 days and 40 nights, he dissolved the ego. He eliminated it. He destroyed the ego and he destroyed the ignorance that went with it. Therefore, he was completely clear. Right? He went into beingness, just like we're understanding here, as I've talked about with self-inquiry. Right? So through those 40 days and through those 40 nights came the elimination of the ego and ignorance, and therefore he was clear. He was communing with God all the time, because God, again, is not some outside force. God is not something that is outside of us. Even when I'm talking about the living God, I'm just talking about what is inside us, what is inside each and every single one of us, who we really are. But what is this one will? Right? This one will is the will of the living God. So therefore, as we look at the living God is in everyone, is in everything. It is everything that represents the mind. It is everything that represents creation, right? It is the God of the living. And everything that is life is in mind, right? Because it's dynamism, because it cycles through change. Or Brad, weren't you talking about the idea that we want to abolish the mind altogether? When it comes to the ego and when it comes to the ignorance, yes, we do. And as you do that, because it's the ego and the ignorance that's basically trying to create this identity imprint upon yourself, feeding you these thoughts as it latches onto yourself, and therefore giving you these impressions of egoic and ignorant thoughts and feelings and sensations and expressions, to giving you the idea of a false state of identity. That's what we're clearing away. As we clear away the ego in the ignorance, the mind itself just becomes tranquil, right? So it's like that mind is folding back in. It's like I talked about. If this is the self here, this circle, the mind represents the cone. When we were abolishing the ego and the ignorance, that cone folds back into the permanent self, right? So we are basically a clean slate. This is what happens. This is what happened with Ramana Maharshi, where he was able to dissolve all of those things. He was able to dissolve the ego, dissolve the ignorance, and basically just stay as a completely tranquil, clear being, right? This is what it takes for you to commune with God, right? You are working with the ego. You may not even be all the way through it. You may still be going through a process, of dissolving the ego and dissolving the ignorance. But as you're going through that process, God is becoming clear through you. And this is the living God. So the living God, relating to, again, within ourselves, is the great mind, the great soul, the great spirit. God is spirit. Now, God has no vessel, has no physical body of his or her own. We are the vessel. So when it comes to the living God needs us as much as we need him or her, right? So when we're looking into the nature of the living God, we become the living vessel, right? So when a person feels like they have devoted themselves to God, they have been touched by God, the Spirit of the living God is upon them, as it were, if we're looking into biblical reference. And we're now feeling that flow of God speaking through us. The mother, the father, the grandfather, the grandmother, the creator, the one, etc. Whatever you want to call it. But again, the nature is that it is the living God, right? It has willed itself into being. And it has brought forward everything that represents thoughts, feelings, expressions, experiences. Everything, again, is simultaneously present, simultaneously here and now. It's like, again, that we're not seeing, the idea of us going into tomorrow, right? That illusionary standpoint and seeing that something is newly created doesn't work that way. Everything is simultaneously coexistent. Everything, again, pertaining to thought, pertaining to feeling, pertaining to emotion, pertaining to expression, pertaining to experience, pertaining to matter, pertaining to energy, pertaining to dimension, pertaining to density, pertaining to the universe. All simultaneously here and now, coexistent within ourselves. So the living God, again, is the sovereign, representing all of that. And that when you decide to go into that devotion, right, you dedicate yourself to God, it is God that decides to work with you. God chooses you, right? The Creator chooses you. The divine chooses you. It does not matter if you feel that you are completely dedicated to the feeling of God, yet you're still stumbling over the ignorances and the egoic properties that are within you. God is basically deciding to work with certain people, right? And so again, it's like the old saying, even through the Wicca, even through ancient traditions as well too, Spirit will decide to work with you. Spirit chooses you. You don't choose Spirit. And that's the nature of the living God, right? And so as I was having this downloading conversation with God, it just comes through flow. It's like a voice that is not a voice. It is like a presence that is not a presence, because it's all just happening through the one. But I asked God, I basically said again as Father. Sometimes I'll say Father, sometimes I'll say Mother, just all depends, right? But I basically said, Father, why did you create life? So that you can be as I am, was the pure flow answer. So that you can be as I am. That's it. I even asked the living God, is the permanent self, right, who we really are, the absolute, aware of you? No. Because again, God is the overseer, the sovereign of the mind, right? The God mind, the God soul, the God spirit. God and self are truly one. But when we're looking at the nature of the living God, the self knows only of the self. It knows of nothing that works together through the mind. It knows nothing of impermanence, right? And the living God has a personality, which is interesting because the living God is permanence, but the living God also has a personality. It has all personalities, we could say. You could say it has all faces, our faces. Has all voices, our voices. So the idea is that the living God is teaching us how to be like God. Perfect, right? Because God knows only of perfection. God knows nothing of lack. Lack, again, is not even acknowledged in the eyes of the living God, right? God realizes that, yes, there is lack there, but it is not acknowledged, right? It is all just coming into the perfection. That which is imperfect will never last. It will break itself down. And it's coming into that perfection, and we're moving into that perfection as we go into permanence of being, where again we completely eliminate the ego and the ignorance, and we are a clean slate, and we are being. We are being, we are being, we are being. We are aware of our awareness, and we are clean, right? That's really what it is to be a clean soul. Or basically you could say just the clean self, right? Is having absolutely no form of egoic properties, of ignorance at all. All of that is being dissolved. All of that is being eliminated. The ego dies. And so, working as one with the living God, which again is within each and every single one of us. Whenever these situations upon the earth take place, where there is a tragedy, where there is a chaotic event, it's those who listen and it's those who see that are the first responders. And again, these are the ones that the living God chooses, right? There are people who act firstly. They know what's happening relating to these travesties, these tragedies, these intense situations that take place. They instantly know what's going on, and they know what to do, and they will work together with their appropriate groups, and they will be the first responders, right? But they're also very humble, deeply within. It's like looking again at what Jesus said as well. He who is first will be last. One who is eager to get to know God, right? But again is not doing the work, will be last. And the last, being humble, will be first. So again, this was a very, very beautiful experience I had this afternoon, just walking through the park and having a conversation with God. Having a conversation with the living God, the Mother, the Father, the Divine, the One. And knowing this, it feels like just a lot of pieces of a puzzle were just being put together before myself. Now, an interesting thing was that Lao Tzu, author of the Tao Te Ching, would talk about something interesting in the Tao Te Ching, such as it was, I don't know how old the way is, but it is older than God, right? So even what Lao Tzu is saying is that he's talking about the permanent self. When we're looking at the way, right, the Tao, we're looking at the absolute. We're looking at the self. And that is absolutely true, right? The absolute, the self that we truly are, the permanent self, is older than God. Because again, God would signify the awareness, right? The bringing in of the mind, the bringing in of life, so that we can have an awareness pertaining to life. There are those in that sense who will simply just go back into stillness, who will go back into permanence, who will go back into perfection, and they will absorb themselves back into the self. And of course, that is what it is. And there are those in that sense that will stand with the living God, just as Jesus did through his demonstration of the resurrection, which I am going to be talking about in the upcoming New Earth Teachings episode that will follow after Off-World Civilizations. I will be talking about resurrection and the immortal body. And it is through that immortal body, it is through that body itself that represents the perfection. It is as how God sees us. It's like I said, God does not recognize lack. God does not acknowledge lack. But God sees you in that perfection of the perfect, immortal, resurrected body. So there will be more on that in the next episode following Off-World Civilizations through New Earth Teachings. So I look forward to looking deeper into that, creating that video for you guys as well too. And again, today I just wanted to share this wonderful experience I had, communing with God, having a conversation with God, and again, having a lot of the puzzle pieces fitting together in the puzzle, to know that we are the living God, every single one of us. God is always within us, never without. So again, what is your connection? How devoted are you to the One, to the Divine, to the Mother, to the Father? Right? How are you creating your path, leading into the permanence of self, being your true self again, because you've always been it, clearing away the ego, clearing away the ignorance. Again, these will be more topics that we'll be discussing in future videos on this YouTube channel. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll speak to you again in another perspective of the now. Take care and be well. Thank you very much for checking out the New Earth Teachings YouTube channel. Feel free to check out my websites, newearthteachings.com, healingcodecards.com, healingcodeshop.com. Go on to healingcodecards.com to grab your body deck and your mind deck, also available in digital versions as well. And of course, you can follow me on social media, on Facebook, on MeWe, and of course on Telegram as well. Thank you again for tuning in, and I'll speak to you again in the next video. Take care and show the way.